group. But for most people, the biggest piece in this huge package is the income tax cut, funded by the increased tax on drillers. Here to talk about that are Dale Butland, veteran of many Democratic political and cause campaigns, and now the communications director of the think tank Innovation Ohio, and Neil Clark, the former budget director for the Ohio Senate Republican Caucus, and now the owner of Grant Street Consultants. So first of all, let's talk about Governor Kasich talking about a tax increase, which is kind of unusual. He has always talked against tax increases, but this would also go towards something he's talked about since he even launched his campaign for governor, the eventual elimination of the state income tax. Are these two things that...
Well, it's really not a tax increase. It's a tax modernization. It's a tax reform.
That's not a tax increase.
It's not a tax increase because what he's doing is he's taking the existing structure now, changing it dramatically, and placing and bringing it into the modern day world. So when you look at what he's doing in the shale industry, he's making us very similar to what's happening in other states. West Virginia charges, I believe, 5%. Texas is 7.5%. Alaska's 25%. And so what he has put on the table today of a fairly low rate for the initial first years of drilling, and then going up to a higher rate of 4%, I wouldn't look at as a tax increase because it's also mixed with a tax cut on the income tax. So in that is where I look at these more as tax reform and tax modernization.
Well, I would say, first off, that we certainly agree with the governor that Ohio's severance tax needs to be modernized and it needs to be made competitive. We also agree that regular Ohioans, and not just the oil companies, should benefit from the extraction of our natural resources. But where we disagree is that I don't believe that there's any reason that Ohio's severance tax should continue to be among the lowest in the nation. That's point one. And also disagree that Ohioans should have their state taxes cut by a little bit, but then their local taxes have to be continued to be raised by a lot in order to pay for the governor's massive cuts to schools and local governments. And then finally, the last thing I'd say is that we disagree that the localities in which this new drilling is going to take place should get no help for their damaged roads and other problems that they're going to encounter. Now, the governor says, oh, I'm going to give them $25,000 per well is what they're going to have to pay. But he also says that they can get a property tax cut equal to that amount, equal to what they pay in this damaged road fee. So in other words, it's revenue neutral. Well, if it's revenue neutral, how exactly does that help the local governments that are having their roads damaged?
You both agree on one thing real quickly here. I want to ask you about this idea that the taxes are low, the severance tax is low.
Absolutely.
The Ohio Oil and Gas Association put out a statement saying it opposes this, saying that this tax increase could hurt one, since it's targeting an emerging industry. Will it hurt the emerging industry in Ohio?
No. I mean, both Dale and I, he works for a think tank. I read his material. I read other think tanks' materials. And every report that I've seen from other states, from Policy Matters, name them, most of the studies will suggest that any type of tax increase has not stopped any form of development. So if I were the Oil and Gas Association, I wouldn't be using that argument. When they put out a report a few weeks ago, they said, this industry will create 65,000 new jobs. About 28,000 is in the industry itself. The rest of them are in ancillary businesses, the Walmarts, the pharmacy stores, the other things, the restaurants that come with it. And that's my response to Dale, in that you don't have to have a package that creates and fixes the roads in that same device that we're talking about today. It's the other things that will create the business in the community that enable the local governments to collect their taxes and be able to use it for their own priorities. So when we're looking at all this, for somebody to say, oh, this is going to destroy the economic development, the governor responded to that by saying, I'm going to keep your rate down low for the first year while you're developing your pad, and that's what they're called. They're called pads, and each pad has 5 or 6 drilling holes, and those pads cost about $6 million. And next to the pads is usually some kind of a transfer station, and then maybe a fracking station, depending on what things that they're doing. So my point to you is that once that's done, they get taxed at a pretty good clip because we're also taxing liquid. And we haven't been doing that in the past. And that's where all the money's really going to come from. It's not going to come from this natural gas extraction as they did in other states.
So if we haven't been taxing the liquid, is that a tax increase?
No, like I said, it's a tax reform because, again, in modernization, because we're also mixing it against the tax reduction on the income tax.
So let's kind of put this in perspective for your viewers. Ohio's severance tax under Governor Kasich's proposal will not just be lower than, say, the state of Texas, which is a very gas and oil friendly state. It'll also be lower than even neighboring states like Michigan or even West Virginia. Now,
eventually it will, or starting out it will? Starting
out and even eventually, because even the highest point at which that tax is levied is still lower than West Virginia has, which, as Neil said, is 5%. Now, we have about $550 billion worth of oil that's in our Utica shale. That's what the industry says. If we raised our tax rate, our severance tax rate, just to that of Texas, not the highest in the country, but just to that of Texas, which is 4.6%, we could raise somewhere between 6 and 15 times more money, more revenue for Ohioans than we can under the governor's plan. And that money could go for a variety of things. Remember, schools have been cut by $3 billion, local government fund by 50%. If you're a local taxpayer, you've got to either raise your taxes locally through levies and whatnot, or you have to do without those services. And that's why I think this thing, with all due respect to Neil, is a shell game. The governor says, well, I'll cut your tax at the state level a little bit, but you're going to have to pay a lot more at the local level in order to sustain these cuts.
Now this shale game.
Shell game, shale game.
This shale game, Dale's making some valid points in certain areas. But, you know, the one thing I found in my 32 years in the State House is that rarely do we go along with other states what they do. It seems to be, if that were the case, I probably would win the majority of my legislative issues by just saying that the other states do that. It doesn't work that way. You have to look at the total composition of what's happening here. I think that it was real important that the state take its time in developing a tax policy, take a look at the other side of the issue, which is what is it doing to the environment, and taking your time to make sure that we don't have any more earthquakes, that we don't have any poisoning of water, et cetera. So I think we need to take our time before we rush to go take in this money and think that we're going to all get a pretty big tax cut. Let me be clear about this tax cut. You know, right now in 2010, there was about $8.3 billion collected in this state from 5.3 million taxpayers. The effective tax rate in this state was about 2.53%. Okay, and if you just took it 1/10, what would a 1/10% cut be? That's only $329 million off of that effective tax cut. So it takes a lot of money to make a tax cut. Now, are you going to do a permanent tax cut or a temporary tax cut? And if you remember in the 90s, we did a bunch of temporary tax cuts, and I can tell you today, nobody remembers it. The question is that in order to make good tax policy, in order to make this fair, is we need to have a permanent tax cut. We need to do total tax reform in this state again to readjust a lot of things that have happened since 2005. So we're making sure that both local governments and education are being funded properly with the resources that are available. Without dominating this, you know, when we look at what the decision was under the court cases all through the 90s, you know, they said there was too much reliance on property tax. We're going back to, if you noticed on Tuesday, there are a lot of school districts that came up past property taxes because they got reductions this year. And so we need to start saying to ourselves, are we preparing ourselves for another DeRolf?
I agree. And let me just say one other thing, if I may. Let me go back to a point that you made at the outset, Karen. When you talked about the oil companies who are all complaining, and they're saying, oh, you know, if you raise this tax too high, we're going to take our drills and go somewhere else. Well, there's a couple of points to be made. A, if you want to drill in Utica shale, which is what we have in Ohio, you have to go where the Utica shale is. That's here. It's not somewhere else. In that sense, this industry is not like the steel industry or the auto industry where you could theoretically build a plant anywhere. You have to go to where the shale is. That's point one. Point two, it strains credulity, and I simply do not believe that oil companies are going to be willing to leave $550 billion worth of revenue and profits in the ground simply because they were being asked to pay the same tax rate they're already paying in Texas.
Well, we've already established that's just not a good argument. But also, let's always keep this in mind. These resources are going to last about 15 years. These resources belong to me. Right. They belong to you. They belong to you. They belong to this state. So while we're extracting these natural resources, we ought to get our fair share out of it.
Well, is the income tax cut the best way to get that fair share? Is that the best way to use this money?
And that was my point, is that the argument, I think the chief argument here, is over how you spend this revenue. The governor says that he wants to do it in an income tax cut, which is going to be pennies a week for the average Ohioan. It's going to be something.
For some people, it's going to be a lot of money. 5% is a lot of money for top income earners.
Well, it's going to be more for them, certainly, but my point is that as long as the need for local tax increases remains, because the Kasich budget cuts are still unaccounted for, it's just what he's given with the left hand, he's taken away with the right hand. And to be honest with you, too, I simply don't believe for him to have a tax rate that is this low. What he wants to do, for some reason that I don't quite understand, is he wants to give the oil companies a break that they're not getting in many other states. And to be honest with you, Ohioans who are already getting gouged by the oil companies for $4 a gallon gas, I don't think are going to be in much of a mood to give them much of a break any further than.
Well, Texas actually, even though they have a much higher rate of 4.6% and a 7.5% tax on certain components, give a bunch of deductions. So when you're comparing apples to apples, it's not as easy to do. But when you look at this, and you said 5%, and I take exception with that 5%, because what Tim Keene was saying, when this gets fully implemented, 2016, 2017, it may be as high as 5%. In the first few years, it is not. And to let the public believe that it is going to generate $500 million next year is not true. 1.5% of that number, it's probably going to be less than $100 million.
But from a political point of view, it's beautiful for the governor, you see, because the first of those tax refunds don't occur until 2014, which coincidentally is the year he's up for re-election. So it'll be very little money. But
if he actually wanted to do it that way, what the governor would have done is sent you a check. All he's going to do is take it off of your tax return next year.
But here's my point. He can take credit for cutting your state taxes while putting the blame on the mayors, the city councils, the county commissioners, the school boards. They're going to have to be asking for tax increases because of his budget cuts.
And speaking about mayors, so we have the Cleveland mayor for now for the third time in my lifetime in the State House, coming back to the State House saying, we got problems. And oh, by the way, we're broke. And they give the impression to the General Assembly that they're only $200 million in the hole. When in fact, if you go to the Department of Education and look at their 5-year financial statements, they're going to be short over $1 billion. And they're coming in and say, give us all this control and let's get rid of all the labor contracts and that will make us whole.
Now, the governor has said that the Cleveland mayor's plan is not quite ready yet, and so that's still, I think, in process. It would make a difference
if it's quite ready or not. The numbers aren't going to work.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about this whole idea of local governments. What is the future for local governments here? I mean, you've said, Neil, that you build this and jobs will come. That will help repair the roads and fix the schools and provide a tax base. But when we did tax reform in 2005, the jobs that were all promised then didn't materialize. How do you know that this is going to work and that's going to really create the jobs that are going to be needed for local governments?
The Ohio Business Roundtable in 2006, 1 year after the implementation of the tax reform, put out a report and said that tax reform would lead to $3.2 billion reduction in state taxes, state and local taxes, $2 billion reduction in income taxes, and it would increase jobs in Ohio by 78,500. Okay, and it never happened. But what we also said to the local governments is that you're no longer going to get the tax on the tangible personal property tax, and that started this thing that has been happening to date, is that we should have addressed that problem in 2005 rather than putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. So eventually when the governor gets into office, whether it's Governor Strickland or Governor Kasich, they were always faced with how they were going to deal with paying for that tangible personal property tax cut. And that's $1.6 billion on the table that has been taken off to local governments without any preparation. Yeah, and that's a problem.
And I think most Ohioans understand that we've been through a terrible economic time. We've had the worst recession since the Great Depression. And everybody understands that to close a budget hole, whether it was $5 billion or $8 billion is immaterial, it was a hole. In order to close that, there's going to have to be sacrifice. Our view is that yes, there has to be sacrifice, but let's make it shared sacrifice, where everybody ponies up a little bit. And to this moment, The wealthiest Ohioans have never been asked to sacrifice anything. The only thing they've been asked to do is to take another tax cut. And here's the governor today telling them he's going to give them another tax cut.
I'm not going to argue with him on that. I mean, I look at this state, and both of my kids are going out of state for college, wondering if they'll ever come back to Ohio. And I look at two things here, is that we have an obligation to take care of our elderly. We have an obligation to take care of our kids. And our kids need to be educated with the best kind of education at the lowest cost, so they're not coming out of college with this huge debt. And it's unfortunate to abandon our elderly in the last few years of their life. I wish that we would take a look at some of these things and say, what do we really need to do? But right now, that's not the discussion yet. And people have to decide that. The local mayors have to come in. This is why I'm so interested about this Cleveland plan. If they let this Cleveland plan go, why wouldn't Dublin come in and say, I don't want to pay for labor contracts? And Cincinnati comes in and says, I don't want to pay for labor contracts.
And that is exactly one of the biggest problems with the so-called Cleveland plan. We have several problems with it, not the least of which is giving some of this property tax revenue to charter schools, which we're not crazy about either. But so many of the compensation proposals, so many of the things dealing with teachers, is almost like a Senate Bill 5 redux. It's many of the same things that the voters just turned down by 61% of the vote last fall are coming back in this new iteration. I think that needs to be changed.
They just didn't know what they were doing in issue 2. I mean, it was a wording problem.
Let me just ask you a final question here. Are we setting things up here for more taxes on the local level if indeed this income tax cut doesn't help create the jobs that local governments need? And are we setting it up for eventually a state income tax increase in 15 years when these resources are going away?
In Ohio, do we have to live in local government?
Yeah. So,
I think that they're faced with some serious dilemmas down the road. As we keep doing a policy to protect the state's interests, we may be creating a different situation at the local level.
I normally am not a big fan of conspiracy theories, but I really believe that what the governor is up to here is I think, even though he got beaten badly on issue 2 when we repealed Senate Bill 5, I think what he really wants to do is he thinks time is on his side. And if he sits there and keeps starving schools and local governments for money, yeah, we just had a Good Tuesday last week where we had the highest number of school levies passed in 12 years. But that can't go on in perpetuity. Sooner or later, Governor Kasich thinks that local taxpayers are going to revolt and that they're going to start laying off teachers, police, firefighters, which is what he wanted in Senate Bill 5, but the voters wouldn't give him. He thinks he can get it another way.
All you have to do is go to the Department of Education, look at the 5-year financial reports, and you'll see even in your own school district that there's a great likelihood that they are in a deficit. And that concerns me a lot.
Was there anything that you didn't see in this overall plan that you were hoping to see from the governor?
Well, first of all, we haven't seen the plan because it doesn't exist yet in written form. So I don't know if I see it because I haven't.
And there will be 2,000 pages when we do see it.
I'm not quite sure. It'll pass in 2 days, so I'm really not sure what's in it. So at this stage, no, I applaud him. I actually wanted him to go ahead and do the shale severance tax increases. I wanted it to be in the form of an income tax, but I also wanted it in the form of a permanent income tax.
As I said at the outset, my 2 biggest problems, and the 2 biggest problems that my organization has with this is, A, we have a tax on oil and gas extraction that is still too low and still far below those of other states, and number 2, it's how we spend the money. He wants to give it in a very small state income tax cut. We think that it ought to be used to make the schools and local governments whole so that local taxpayers are not burdened with higher taxes at the local level.
Dale Butland, Neil Clark, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
And that's it for this week. For my colleagues at Ohio Public Radio and Television, thanks for watching. If you'd like to ask questions, make comments, or watch this week's show or earlier episodes, please visit our website at statenews.org. You can also check us out on Facebook. And please join us again next time for the State of Ohio.